guys, this is Shoshanah Shear of beahappymom.com and my online store, which you can see at creationsfromjerusalem.com. In today's video, I want to talk a little bit about how much I knew of occupational therapy before I became an occupational therapist, and even before I started studying occupational therapy, that is. The first situation was when I was a much younger child. My sister went for occupational therapy. I wasn't really sure of what her needs were as to why she went for occupational therapy. I understand something to do with some learning related challenges, gross motor development perhaps. In any event, for me as the younger sibling, my exposure to occupational therapy was that my sister went into this building. I knew nothing of what took place inside. My mother and I spent time in a park quite often on a sunny day. It was a hot park, and we had to spend 30 minutes, 40 minutes, perhaps a little bit longer, while my sister was indoors. Now, if I was actually invited into the occupational therapy room, I probably would have absolutely loved it. I love doing puzzles, I love the colors, I love the activities, I love the games, I love so much about occupational therapy. But for me, occupational therapy was this building that my sister went into, where she spent a certain amount of time while I spent time in the park, waiting for her to complete whatever this occupational therapy was. My next encounter with occupational therapy was in a little bit of a hidden way. Many years later, when I came to work in neurosurgery, I appreciated what this encounter was. And that was that my mother had had a stroke when I was 7 years old, and she, of her own initiative, started to do certain things which enabled her to regain function in certain areas. For example, she went singing in the choir to help to improve her speech difficulty. Now, all this time later, I can appreciate engaging in an occupation to help to improve a certain level of function, to regain a certain level of function. At the time, I had no idea that this was an aspect of occupational therapy. That particular example overlaps with speech therapy. Something else my mother did was drawing, and she was drawing with her left hand, even though she was right-handed. And of her own initiative, she built up the pen or the pencil that she was drawing with. That would be occupational therapy, but I had no idea of that at the time. My next encounter with occupational therapy was when we moved to South Africa, and there I came to know my grandfather, who you read about in my book. We'll come to that in a little bit. One of the first physical things that made an impression on me was when I visited the house that to me at that stage was new. That obviously purchased the house while we were still living in what was Rhodesia. And what was intriguing to me about this house was that the steps to go up into the garden and to go from the garden to the balcony or the veranda, as they called it, were ramped. The guest bathroom also was of a certain size, and it had a grab rail next to the toilet. And this to me was intriguing. I had no idea that this is an area of occupational therapy known as accessibility for the disabled people. There's a whole area of ergonomics and of making sure that a home, an office, and so on will be accessible to the disabled. All I knew was that my grandfather had taken the care to ensure that his friends who were disabled could be able to get into his garden and into his home. Another intriguing thing was that some of his flower beds were raised. They were not the normal flower beds at ground level. They were raised at least this much up from the ground, and that meant that his friends who were in wheelchairs were able to appreciate the flowers. Once again, I had no idea that this had anything to do with occupational therapy. If you read anything in my book, you'll discover that as an 8-year-old, I went to start doing volunteering at an organization called St. Giles for the Disabled in Cape Town. And one of the first things I was involved in where I was volunteering was the disabled table tennis. And for me, seeing people in wheelchairs being able to play table tennis, I was the one who was running around collecting the ball when it would go in an area too difficult or too far away for those in a wheelchair to be able to obtain it quickly and easily. But I had no idea that in order to be able to learn to maneuver the wheelchair, to learn to play table tennis from a wheelchair, and a number of other experiences and areas of function would fall into the area of occupational therapy. So I'd actually been introduced to aspects of occupational therapy without knowing what it was. There were 3 other areas or incidents in which I came to know perhaps the name of occupational therapy. The one was that my mother had told me that in amongst her considering what kind of career she would get involved in, one of the professions she was interested in was occupational therapy. The only explanation she'd given to me as to one reason that she didn't choose occupational therapy was that at that stage, instead of doing shadowing an occupational therapist or going and spending time in an occupational therapy department in South Africa, they had to go and spend some time observing a surgery taking place in the operating theatre, and that for my mother was very difficult. Now, not everybody has to have that as their introduction to potentially going to work in the hospital, but that was the exercise that was offered at the time, and something that for my mother was difficult. But I knew nothing from that little description as to what occupational therapy was. As a 16-year-old, I actually went volunteering in a hospital, and I spent time taking magazines around, I'd spent time giving cups of tea, I spent time visiting patients in the hospital, I spent time doing their hair, I spent time feeding prem babies, but at no stage were we as volunteers taken to visit the different paramedical therapy departments. I didn't go to the physio, I didn't go to the occupational therapist, I didn't go to the speech therapist. I had no encounter with any of those professions, and really that's a pity. So the last time in which I had a sort of a connection with occupational therapy before coming to study this profession was going to the career guidance counsellor. And as I say time and time again, the only thing that the career guidance counsellor was able to say to me was, she asked me what my school subjects were, and her summary of how to combine all of my interests and high school subjects was in the profession of occupational therapy. She could not give me a definition. She could not explain to me what an occupational therapist does. She told me nothing about where an occupational therapist works, and she told me nothing about expected types of salaries or anything else about what it would be like to be an occupational therapist. She just told me that given your subjects, this is what you should do. Well, now, all these years later, I'm saying to you, if you have any indication or anybody mention to you that perhaps occupational therapy would be a good profession for you, if you have a need for somebody to go for occupational therapy, whether it's a sibling, whether it's a child of yours, a relative, and you don't know what the profession is, don't be in the dark. You don't have to notice ramps and not know that occupational therapy has something to do with that. You can have a look at my book. It's available online on Amazon.com and a number of other online bookstores such as Barnes & Noble's, Book Depository, a number of other online bookstores, and you can read this book. And in the book you'll be able to discover how occupational therapy can interact with and assist people throughout the life cycle. So you don't have to be in the situation that I was in. You don't have to be in the dark. You don't have to be intrigued or wonder, what is this name? What is this profession? You can read my book and you can discover for yourself what occupational therapy is. And if you want to know more, once you've read my book, You're welcome to be in touch with me, and I would highly recommend that you go and visit an occupational therapy department. If you're considering the profession, I would also recommend that you go and shadow an occupational therapist and get to know what this profession is about. No longer need to be in the dark. You can purchase my book and find out more.